Welcome to Bedtime Express, your peaceful journey to dreamland. I'm here to guide you through the night with stories that soothe the soul and calm the mind. Tonight, we're embarking on an epic adventure with Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, as he makes his legendary 10-year journey home from the Trojan War. You'll drift alongside him as he encounters the mysterious Lotus-Eaters, outwits the mighty Cyclops Polyphemus, resists the enchanting songs of the Sirens, and finally returns to his beloved wife, Penelope. This gentle retelling of Homer's classic tale is designed to carry you peacefully into sleep, with soothing narration and dreamy pacing that will transport you to ancient seas and magical islands. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please give this video a like, leave a comment about your favorite part of the story, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more peaceful adventures. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a trip to dreamland. Now, find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow the gentle rhythm of the story to wash over you like peaceful waves on a distant shore. It's time to board the Bedtime Express and sail away to the realm of dreams. Our story begins as the great city of Troy falls, and brave Odysseus sets sail for home. The Odyssey, Odysseus's 10-year journey home. The great city of Troy had fallen at last, its mighty walls crumbling like sand castles before the tide. After 10 long years of war, the bronze-armed warriors of Greece could finally turn their ships toward home. Among them sailed Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, his heart yearning for his beloved wife Penelope and his young son Telemachus, whom he had left as barely more than a baby. The wine-dark sea stretched endlessly before the Greek ships as they departed from the smoking ruins of Troy. Odysseus stood at the prow of his vessel, the salt spray misting his weathered face as he gazed toward the horizon where his island home waited. Little did he know that the gods had woven a tapestry of trials that would keep him from his family for another 10 years, each thread a test of his wit, courage, and determination. The ships sailed smoothly at first, their white sails billowing like clouds against the azure sky. The crew sang old songs of home, their voices carrying across the gentle waves as dolphins danced alongside their vessels. But the gods, it seemed, had different plans for the hero who had helped devise the great wooden horse that brought down Troy's walls. As the first night fell upon their journey, Odysseus gathered his men around him on the deck. The stars twinkled like scattered diamonds above them, and the moon cast a silver path across the water. "My faithful companions," he said in his warm, resonant voice, "we have survived the trials of war together. Now we sail toward peace, toward the sweet embrace of our families and the familiar shores of home. Let us be vigilant and wise, for the sea holds many mysteries, and the gods may yet test our resolve." The men nodded solemnly, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamps that swayed gently with the ship's rhythm. They had followed Odysseus through countless battles, trusting in his cleverness and leadership. Now, as they embarked on what they hoped would be their final voyage, they felt both eager anticipation and a strange foreboding in their hearts. But the sea, vast and unpredictable, had already begun to whisper its secrets to the winds. Storm clouds gathered on the distant horizon, dark and brooding, while beneath the waves the spirits of the deep stirred restlessly. The journey home would not be the peaceful voyage they had imagined, but rather an odyssey of wonders and terrors that would test every fiber of their being. As the ships continued their course through the night, cutting through the dark waters like silver knives, Odysseus stood watch at the helm. The gentle rocking of the vessel and the rhythmic splash of waves against the hull created a lullaby that would have lulled lesser men to sleep. But the king of Ithaca remained alert, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger or divine intervention. The first sign of trouble came with the dawn, when a strange mist began to rise from the sea. It crept across the water like ghostly fingers, obscuring the sun and casting an eerie twilight over the fleet. The wind, which had been steady and fair, began to shift and swirl, as if confused by some unseen force. Odysseus felt a chill run down his spine, not from the cool mist, but from the certainty that they had entered waters touched by divine power. "Lower the sails," he commanded quietly, his voice carrying easily across the deck despite its gentle tone. "Take up the oars and row carefully. We must navigate by wisdom now, not just by wind and star." His men moved with practiced efficiency, their movements smooth and silent as they prepared for whatever lay ahead in the mysterious mist. The other ships in the fleet followed Odysseus's lead, their captains trusting in his reputation for cunning and foresight. But as the mist thickened around them, the vessels began to lose sight of one another, each becoming an island unto itself in the gray, swirling void. The sound of their oars dipping into the water created a hypnotic rhythm, like a giant heartbeat echoing across the hidden sea. Hours passed in this strange twilight world, where time seemed suspended and direction became meaningless. The crew spoke in whispers, if at all, as if afraid that loud voices might summon something from the depths they were not prepared to face. Odysseus remained calm and steady, though his mind raced with possibilities and plans, always thinking 3 moves ahead like a master at the game of kings. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the mist began to clear. The sun broke through the gray veil like a golden spear, illuminating a sight that filled the sailors' hearts with both wonder and unease. Before them lay an island unlike any they had ever seen, its shores gleaming white as polished marble, its trees heavy with fruit that seemed to glow with an inner light. This was the beginning of their trials, though they could not yet know it. The island beckoned to them like a jewel set in the crown of the sea. Its beaches sparkled with sand finer than crushed pearls, and the air that drifted from its shores carried the scent of flowers, so sweet they seemed like perfume from the gardens of the gods themselves. Odysseus studied the approaching land with his calculating gaze, noting how peaceful it appeared, how inviting its gentle slopes and whispering palms seemed to be. "Captain," called one of his men, a young sailor named Elpenor, whose eyes shone with longing, "surely we can rest here for a while. Our water barrels grow light, and the men are weary from rowing through that strange mist. This place looks like paradise itself." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crew, for indeed the island seemed to promise rest and refreshment after their ordeal. Odysseus nodded slowly, though something in his wise heart counseled caution. "We shall send a small party ashore to explore and gather fresh water," he decided. "But let them go armed and alert, for islands that seem too welcoming sometimes hide secrets in their hearts." He chose 3 of his most trusted men for this task, warriors who had proven themselves brave and clever in the siege of Troy. The small boat cut through the crystal-clear water toward the shore, its oars barely making a ripple in the perfect blue. As the men stepped onto the beach, their feet sank into sand, so soft it felt like silk beneath their worn sandals. The very air seemed to embrace them with warmth and comfort, making their eyelids heavy and their movements slow and dreamlike. They had not walked far inland when they encountered the strangers who dwelt upon this enchanted shore. These people moved with languid grace, their eyes holding a dreamy, distant look, as if they gazed upon sights invisible to others. In their hands they carried flowers of extraordinary beauty, blossoms that seemed to pulse with gentle light and fill the air with their hypnotic perfume. "Welcome, travelers," said one of the island dwellers, her voice as soft as a lullaby sung by a mother to her sleeping child. "You look weary from your journey. Come, taste the lotus flowers that grow here in our peaceful land. One bite will take away all your cares and sorrows, making you forget the troubles that drove you from your homes." She extended a blossom toward them, its petals shimmering like captured moonbeams. The first of Odysseus's men reached out without thinking, drawn by the flower's beauty and the promise of peace it seemed to offer. As soon as the sweet nectar touched his lips, his eyes grew distant and dreamy, and a smile of perfect contentment spread across his weathered face. The worries of war, thoughts of home, even his own name seemed to drift away like morning mist before the sun. His companions, seeing the blissful expression that transformed their friend's features, eagerly tasted the magical blossoms as well. Soon all 3 men sat upon the soft grass beside a babbling brook, their minds filled with nothing but the present moment's gentle pleasure. Hours passed like minutes, and they made no move to return to their ship or remember their mission. Back on the vessel, Odysseus waited and watched as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. When his men failed to return at the appointed time, he felt the familiar stirring of concern that had kept him alive through so many dangers. "Prepare another boat," he commanded. "I will go ashore myself to discover what has become of our companions." He took with him 6 of his strongest warriors, men whose loyalty was matched only by their courage. As they rowed toward the beckoning shore, Odysseus instructed them carefully. "Whatever we find on this island, whatever temptations are offered to us, remember our homes and families waiting beyond the horizon. Sometimes the greatest dangers come disguised as the greatest gifts." They found the 3 missing men exactly where they had succumbed to the Lotus's spell, sitting in blissful ignorance among the gentle inhabitants of the island. When Odysseus called their names, they looked up with vague recognition but no urgency, as if he were a figure from a half-remembered dream. "Come," said the first man dreamily, "taste the sweet flowers and stay with us forever. There is no need to struggle against storms or face the uncertainties of the sea when such perfect peace awaits you here." But Odysseus, master of stratagems, had anticipated such magic. He ordered his companions to bind the enchanted men securely but gently, ignoring their peaceful protests and dreamy pleas to remain. "Forgive me, my friends," he whispered as they carried the 3 back to their boat, "but your wives and children need you more than this island does. True peace comes not from forgetting our duties, but from fulfilling them." They rowed swiftly back to the main ship, where Odysseus ordered the crew to weigh anchor immediately. As they sailed away from the island of the Lotus-Eaters, the enchanted men gradually recovered their senses, though they gazed back at the receding shore with wistful longing. The experience had taught them all a valuable lesson about the seductive power of easy contentment and the importance of remembering one's true purpose. For several days they sailed through calm seas, following the familiar stars that pointed toward home. But the gods, it seemed, were not finished testing the clever king of Ithaca. On the 4th morning, they spotted another island rising from the waves, this one wild and mountainous, shrouded in morning mist that clung to its peaks like a cloak of mystery. This new land was utterly different from the Lotus-Eaters' paradise. Its shores were rocky and forbidding, its forests dark and deep, while smoke rose from various points inland, suggesting the presence of inhabitants who might not welcome strangers with flowers and gentle smiles. Yet their supplies were running low, and Odysseus knew they needed fresh water and provisions if they were to continue their journey home. "This island belongs to the Cyclops," said old Nestor, the wisest of Odysseus's companions, his voice barely above a whisper as they studied the forbidding coastline. "Giants with but one eye each, who know nothing of laws or hospitality. They live in caves high in the mountains and tend great flocks of sheep and goats. It would be wise to approach with utmost caution. But Odysseus, ever curious and bold, saw opportunity where others saw only danger. Perhaps, he mused, these Cyclops might trade with us, or at least allow us to take on fresh water in exchange for news of the wider world. We cannot simply assume they will be hostile without first attempting peaceful contact. His men looked doubtful, but they had learned to trust their leader's judgment through countless perils. They landed on a small uninhabited island just off the main coast, where wild goats roamed freely and a freshwater spring bubbled up from the rocks. Here they made camp and rested, while Odysseus planned their approach to the land of the Cyclops. As night fell and the cooking fires cast dancing shadows on the beach, he selected 12 of his bravest men to accompany him on a reconnaissance mission to the larger island. "We will take gifts," he announced, holding up a skin of wine so fine it had been aged in the sacred groves of Ismarus. "This vintage is so potent that it must be mixed with 20 parts water before drinking, yet its taste is sweeter than honey and more precious than gold. Surely even a giant would appreciate such a treasure." The wine gleamed like liquid rubies in the firelight, and its aroma was so rich that it made the men's mouths water despite their concerns. At dawn, they rowed across the narrow channel separating the two islands, their small boat cutting through waters so clear they could see fish swimming far below, like birds flying through liquid sky. The Cyclops Island loomed larger as they approached, its cliffs towering above them like the walls of a natural fortress built by the hands of primordial gods. They beached their boat in a hidden cove and began climbing the steep path that wound up through scrubby vegetation toward the interior of the island. The going was difficult, but Odysseus pressed on with the tireless determination that had made him famous among the Greeks. His men followed, their weapons ready but concealed, their hearts beating fast with anticipation and fear. As they crested a ridge, they saw before them a sight that made them catch their breath in wonder. Spread across a broad valley were countless flocks of sheep and goats, their fleeces white as clouds against the green grass. These were no ordinary animals, but creatures as large as cattle, with wool so thick and fine it seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. And watching over them in the distance moved figures of impossible size and strength. "The Cyclops," whispered one of the men, his voice filled with awe and terror. "Look how tall they stand, like walking mountains crowned with single eyes that gleam like stars." Indeed, the giants were magnificent and terrible to behold, their massive forms moving with surprising grace as they tended their enormous flocks. Odysseus studied the scene with his calculating gaze, noting the locations of several cave openings in the cliff faces that served as the giants' dwellings. One cave in particular caught his attention, larger than the others and surrounded by a courtyard where the finest sheep grazed peacefully. "There," he said, pointing toward the impressive dwelling, "lives one who must be wealthy and powerful among his people. If we are to make contact, it should be with him." They approached the great cave carefully, noting the massive stone blocks that formed a wall around its entrance, blocks so large that 20 ordinary men could not have moved them. The opening itself was sealed with a boulder that would have taken all their combined strength just to budge, yet to its owner it would be no more than a pebble. Everything about the place spoke of power and wealth beyond mortal comprehension. "The owner is not at home," observed Odysseus after they had watched and waited for some time. "This may be our opportunity to look inside and see what manner of being we are dealing with. Knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, and wisdom is our greatest weapon." With careful effort, they managed to squeeze through a gap in the stone wall and enter the cave's outer courtyard. What they found inside amazed them beyond words. The cave was vast as a temple, its walls lined with shelves that held cheeses as large as wagon wheels and vessels of milk that could have served 100 men. Pens along the sides contained lambs and kids that were themselves larger than full-grown sheep in the mortal world. The wealth displayed here was beyond the dreams of any earthly king. "Captain," urged one of his men, his voice tight with nervousness, "let us take what we can carry and leave this place at once. Surely the owner of all this will not miss a few cheeses and a skin of milk. But if he returns and finds us here, what giant would show mercy to thieves who have invaded his home?" But Odysseus, ever curious about the unknown, shook his head slowly. "No, my friend. We came here to make honorable contact, not to steal like common pirates. We will wait and meet this Cyclops face to face, presenting our gifts and requesting his hospitality according to the ancient laws that govern relations between strangers. Perhaps he will prove more civilized than we expect." So they settled down to wait in the dim recesses of the great cave, sharing bread and wine while they watched the entrance for signs of their host's return. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the distant bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind through the cave's many chambers. As afternoon faded toward evening, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, the thunderous footsteps of an approaching giant. The Cyclops who entered his cave was larger than they had imagined possible. He stood tall as 3 men, with shoulders broad as a ship's beam and arms thick as tree trunks. His single eye, large as a shield and bright as a star, surveyed his domain with satisfaction before fixing upon the small figures huddled in the shadows. This was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, mightiest of all the Cyclopes. "What manner of creatures are these that dare enter my home uninvited?" His voice boomed through the cavern like distant thunder, shaking dust from the ceiling and making the very stones tremble. Are you merchants or pirates, rats that scurry through the darkness seeking what is not yours to take? His massive hand reached for a club carved from an entire tree trunk, its surface polished smooth by years of use. Odysseus stepped forward with all the dignity he could muster, though his heart hammered like a blacksmith's anvil in his chest. "Great Cyclops," he began, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped his men. "We are neither merchants nor pirates, but warriors returning from the sacred war at Troy. The winds and waves have driven us far from our course, and we seek shelter and provisions to continue our journey home. By the laws of hospitality that bind all civilized beings, we ask for your protection and aid." The giant's laughter shook the cave like an earthquake, dislodging small stones that clattered to the floor around the terrified mortals. "Laws of hospitality?" Polyphemus roared with terrible mirth. "We Cyclopes know no law but our own strength, recognize no god but our father Poseidon, who rules the seas. Your Zeus and his commands mean nothing in this place, little man. You speak of Troy. Was it you who helped destroy that noble city with your tricks and lies?" Before Odysseus could reply, the giant rolled the massive boulder across the cave's entrance, sealing them inside as easily as a man might cork a wine jar. The sound echoed through the cavern with terrible finality, and the Greeks realized with growing horror that they were trapped with a being who clearly intended them no good. The single eye gleamed with malevolent amusement as Polyphemus contemplated his unexpected visitors. "Since you have come calling uninvited," the Cyclops continued with mock politeness, "it is only proper that I should offer you the hospitality of my table. Indeed, you shall be the main course." With movements swift as lightning despite his enormous size, he snatched two of the Greeks in his massive hands, crushing them instantly, before devouring them whole like a man might eat grapes. The surviving men recoiled in horror, pressing themselves against the walls of the cave as they watched their comrades meet such a terrible fate. Some wept openly, while others clutched their weapons uselessly, knowing that their bronze points could do little against such a monstrous opponent. But Odysseus, though shaken by the giant's casual brutality, forced his mind to remain clear and calculating. "Think," he told himself silently as Polyphemus settled down to sleep off his gruesome meal. "There must be a way out of this trap. Strength cannot defeat strength when the enemy is so much mightier, but perhaps cunning can find what force cannot." His keen eyes studied every detail of the cave, searching for weaknesses, opportunities, anything that might turn their desperate situation to advantage. The giant's snores soon filled the cavern like the rumbling of a distant avalanche, but sleep eluded the terrified Greeks. They huddled together in the darkness, whispering prayers to gods who seemed very far away, and planning escapes that seemed impossible to achieve. The massive boulder blocking their exit might as well have been a mountain for all their ability to move it. As dawn approached, Polyphemus stirred and rose, stretching his enormous limbs like a cat awakening from a nap. Without ceremony, he seized 2 more of the Greeks and made his breakfast of them, ignoring their screams and the pleas of their companions. Then, as casually as if nothing had happened, he rolled back the stone and departed with his flocks, sealing the cave behind him once more. "We must escape tonight," Odysseus whispered to his remaining men, his voice barely audible above their terrified breathing. "By tomorrow there may be too few of us left to carry out any plan. But I have an idea, dangerous though it may be. First, we must find the right materials, and then we must prepare for the performance of our lives." In the dim light that filtered through cracks in the stone, Odysseus surveyed the cave with the methodical gaze of a master craftsman studying his materials. Near the back wall, among the giant's possessions, he spotted exactly what he had hoped to find: a massive olive wood staff, thick as a ship's mast and tall as a tree, which the Cyclops used as a walking stick. Its tip had been charred in some ancient fire, making the wood harder than bronze. "My friends," he whispered, gathering his 8 surviving companions around him in the deepest shadows of the cave, "listen carefully to what I say, for our lives depend upon it. We cannot match this monster's strength, but we can exceed his cunning. Tonight, when he returns and seals us in once more, we will turn his own confidence against him." His voice carried the quiet authority that had led armies and toppled cities, and despite their fear, the men leaned closer to hear his plan. Working with desperate efficiency, they used their bronze swords to sharpen the great staff's charred end into a point as keen as a spear tip. The work was exhausting, for the wood was hard as stone, but fear gave strength to their tired arms. When the point was ready, they hid the weapon beneath piles of sheep dung, where the giant's enormous eye would not spot it among the cave's usual clutter. As evening shadows began to lengthen outside, they heard the familiar thunder of returning footsteps. Polyphemus drove his flocks into the cave with practiced ease, the enormous sheep filing past like woolly mountains. The giant sealed the entrance with his customary boulder, then settled down to his evening routine of milking and cheese-making, whistling a tune that sounded like distant wind through mountain peaks. This time, however, Odysseus stepped forward before the monster could select his dinner. In his hands he carried the precious wine from Ismarus, its rich aroma filling even that vast space with its intoxicating promise. "Great Cyclops," he said, his voice steady and respectful, "before you dine, will you not try this gift we brought from our ship? It is wine such as mortals offer to the gods themselves, aged in sacred groves and blessed by ancient rituals. Polyphemus paused in his grim preparations, his single eye focusing on the wineskin with sudden interest. The giants, for all their strength and size, were not immune to curiosity, especially when it came to pleasures they had not yet experienced. "Wine, you say?" he rumbled, his voice carrying a note of genuine intrigue. "We Cyclopes make a drink from fermented milk and honey, but we know little of this grape juice that mortals prize so highly." With careful ceremony, Odysseus poured a generous portion into one of the giant's enormous cups, the dark liquid gleaming like liquid garnets in the firelight. The wine's bouquet rose like incense, rich and complex, speaking of summer vineyards and master vintner's art. Polyphemus lifted the cup to his lips and drank deeply, his eye widening with surprise and delight at the exquisite taste. "By my father Poseidon's trident," the giant exclaimed, wiping his mouth with the back of his enormous hand, "this is nectar worthy of Olympus itself. More, little man, pour me more of this divine drink. Such generosity deserves reward. Tell me your name, that I might know who has brought me such pleasure, and perhaps I will eat you last instead of first." Odysseus smiled grimly as he refilled the cup again and again, watching the potent wine take hold of the giant's senses. "My name," he replied carefully, "is Nobody. I am called Nobody by all who know me, and Nobody is the name my parents gave me at birth." The lie rolled off his tongue smoothly, for he had learned long ago that sometimes deception was the kindest form of truth. The wine worked its magic swiftly on a being unaccustomed to such potency. Polyphemus's massive head began to nod, his eyelid growing heavy as the alcohol coursed through his giant frame. "Nobody," he slurred, his voice growing thick and drowsy. "You are a good fellow, this Nobody. As a reward for your excellent wine, I promise you that I will eat Nobody last of all your companions. That shall be my gift to you." With those words, the great Cyclops toppled backward like a falling mountain, his enormous body shaking the cave floor as he landed. His breathing soon deepened into the rumbling snores of one utterly overcome by drink, and wine-tinged drool ran from the corner of his slack mouth. Odysseus waited several more minutes to ensure the giant was truly unconscious, then signaled his men to retrieve their weapon. Working with desperate haste, they thrust the sharpened point of the olive wood staff deep into the coals of the fire, heating it until the tip glowed white-hot like a star fallen to earth. The wood hissed and steamed, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning timber. When the point was ready, 4 of the strongest men helped Odysseus lift the massive weapon and position it carefully above the sleeping giant's single eye. "Now," whispered Odysseus, and they drove the burning point deep into the monster's eye with all their combined strength. The hiss of boiling flesh mingled with Polyphemus's roar of agony as he awakened to blindness and torment. His hands flew to his ruined eye, feeling the wooden shaft protruding from the socket that had once held his precious sight. The giant's screams echoed through the cave and beyond, a sound of such anguish that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the island. He thrashed about wildly, his massive limbs striking the walls and sending sheep scattering in terror. "My eye!" he howled, his voice cracking with pain and rage. "My beautiful eye is destroyed. Nobody has blinded me. Nobody has ruined me." From outside the cave came answering calls as other Cyclopes heard their brothers' cries and came running to investigate. "Polyphemus!" they shouted through the stone barrier. "What troubles you? Who dares attack you in your own home? Is it illness that makes you cry out so, or some enemy that we must help you destroy?" "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus roared back, his voice distorted by pain and fury. "Nobody has blinded me with fire and trickery. Help me catch Nobody before he escapes." But his fellow giants, hearing this confused response, merely laughed and shook their massive heads in bewilderment. "If nobody is harming you, brother," they called back, already beginning to drift away, "then why do you wake us with your shouting? If nobody attacks you, then you need no help from us. Perhaps it is some sickness sent by Zeus. Pray to your father Poseidon for healing, and let us return to our sleep." Their heavy footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Polyphemus alone with his agony and his trapped prey. Odysseus smiled grimly in the darkness, for his clever wordplay had worked exactly as planned. But their escape was far from certain, for the blinded giant still guarded the cave's entrance with murderous intent. Polyphemus felt his way to the great boulder and rolled it aside, then sat in the opening with his arms outstretched, determined to catch his tormentors as they tried to flee. "Come then, Nobody," the giant snarled, his voice dripping with hatred and pain. "Try to escape past my hands. I may be blind, but I can still feel and hear and crush. You will not leave this island alive to boast of how you tricked Polyphemus, son of Poseidon." His enormous fingers flexed in anticipation, ready to seize and destroy anything that tried to pass through the cave mouth. But Odysseus, master of stratagems, had prepared for this very situation. Among Polyphemus's flock were rams of extraordinary size, their fleeces thick and woolly as storm clouds. Working quickly and silently, the Greeks lashed themselves beneath the largest of these animals, clinging to the dense wool with desperate strength. Odysseus himself chose the finest ram of all, a magnificent creature whose fleece was soft as silk and whose size rivaled that of a small horse. As dawn approached, the sheep began their customary movement toward the pastures outside. They filed past their master in their usual orderly fashion, while he ran his hands over their backs to ensure no human intruders escaped with his flock. The giant's touch was thorough but not suspicious, for he expected treachery from above, not from below. When the great ram carrying Odysseus approached the entrance, Polyphemus paused and spoke to his favorite animal with surprising tenderness. "My beautiful ram," he murmured, his voice soft with affection despite his pain, "why do you linger so? Usually you are first to reach the sweet grass in the morning, first to drink from the clear stream. Are you grieving for your master's eye, my faithful friend? If only you could speak and tell me where that villain nobody hides himself." The ram, bearing its hidden burden, finally moved past the giant's searching hands and out into the fresh morning air. One by one, the other sheep followed, carrying their secret passengers to freedom. Only when they were well away from the cave did the Greeks dare to release their holds and drop to the ground, their limbs stiff from clinging so long to the thick wool. They ran swiftly to their hidden boat, their hearts pounding with the joy of unexpected survival. As they rowed desperately toward their main ship, Odysseus could not resist the temptation to reveal his true identity to the blinded giant. "Polyphemus," he called across the widening water, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "If anyone asks who put out your eye, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." The giant's roar of rage shook the very mountains as he realized how completely he had been deceived. In his fury, he hurled enormous boulders toward the sound of Odysseus's voice, the massive stones striking the water with tremendous splashes that nearly swamped the small boat. But the Greeks rowed with the strength of desperation, and soon they were beyond even a giant's throwing range. Then Polyphemus raised his arms toward heaven and called upon his divine father with a voice that echoed across land and sea. "Hear me, Poseidon, Earthshaker, ruler of the deep blue sea. If I am truly your son, grant me vengeance upon this Odysseus who has blinded me. Let him never reach his home, or if the fates decree he must, let him arrive late and alone, having lost all his ships and companions." The sea god heard his son's prayer, and far beneath the waves, mighty Poseidon's anger began to stir like a gathering storm. The price of Odysseus's cleverness would be higher than he could have imagined, for he had made an enemy of one of the most powerful gods in all creation. But for now, the immediate danger was past, and the Greeks sailed swiftly away from the island of the Cyclops, their precious lives intact despite their terrible ordeal. Days passed in relative peace as they sailed through waters that seemed to grow stranger with each league. The very color of the sea began to change, shifting from familiar blue to deep purple, then to shades of silver and gray that hurt the eyes to look upon. The stars themselves appeared different here, arranged in patterns that no mortal astronomer had ever charted. "Captain," said Eurylochus, Odysseus's trusted second-in-command, his voice troubled as he studied the alien constellations, "we have sailed beyond the edges of the world we know. These are waters where mortals were never meant to venture, realms that belong to gods and spirits alone. Perhaps we should turn back while we still can find our way." But even as he spoke, a mist began to rise from the sea around them, thick and grey as the breath of sleeping giants. This was no ordinary fog, but something that seemed to carry voices within its swirling depths, whispers in languages both ancient and forgotten. The very air grew cold and heavy, pressing down upon the ship like the weight of centuries. "Lower the sails," Odysseus commanded quietly, his voice steady despite the unease that gripped his heart. "Take up the oars and row gently. We are entering a realm where the laws of the living world hold little sway. Whatever we encounter here, we must show proper respect to powers greater than our own." The mist grew thicker as they rowed forward, until they could barely see their own hands before their faces. The water beneath their hull had turned black as polished obsidian, reflecting no light from above. Strange sounds echoed through the fog, the creaking of ghostly ships, the crying of birds that had never known the warmth of sun, the sighing of winds that carried the scent of flowers long dead. Then, through the swirling grey, they saw a sight that made their blood freeze in their veins. A shoreline appeared before them, but it was like no coast in the world of the living. The beach was black sand mixed with what looked like powdered bone, while beyond it stretched a forest of leafless trees that seemed to twist and writhe in the windless air. This was the entrance to Hades, the realm of the dead. "The witch Circe spoke truly," Odysseus murmured to himself, remembering the prophecy that had sent him on this impossible quest. "Here lies the only path to the knowledge I seek. Only by speaking with the dead can I learn the way home to my beloved Ithaca." He had come to consult the spirit of the prophet Tiresias, whose wisdom transcended even death itself. They beached their ship on that terrible shore, its keel scraping against sand that felt cold even through their sandals. Following the instructions Circe had given him, Odysseus walked inland until he found the place she had described, a grove where two rivers met, their waters flowing together into a pool black as midnight. Here the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin as morning mist. With his bronze sword, he dug a pit in the earth, its edges perfectly square as befitted a sacred ritual. Into this pit he poured offerings to the dead, first honey, sweet as summer memories, then milk white as cloud, then wine dark as dried blood. Over all he sprinkled barley meal while speaking the ancient words that would summon the spirits from their shadowy realm. The response was immediate and terrifying. From the pit rose whispers that grew steadily louder, voices of the countless dead crying out for the taste of blood that would give them temporary strength to speak. Shadows began to gather around the sacred place, indistinct at first, but gradually taking on the forms of those who had once walked beneath the sun. They came in endless procession, warriors who had died at Troy, their wounds still fresh and bleeding, women who had perished in childbirth, their faces pale with loss, children taken before their time, their eyes wide with confusion and sorrow. All reached toward the pit with desperate hunger, for the blood of sacrifice was the only thing that could restore their memories and voices. But Odysseus stood firm with his sword drawn, following Circe's instructions precisely. "Hold back, spirits of the departed," he commanded, his voice carrying across the supernatural realm with authority born of divine purpose. "I seek one among you, the prophet Tiresias, who alone can guide me home. Let him drink first, and then others may partake according to my choosing." Through the crowd of shadows came a figure different from the rest, an old man whose blind eyes held wisdom deeper than any earthly sage. This was Tiresias, who had been granted the gift of prophecy by the gods themselves, and whose knowledge encompassed past, present, and future alike. Even in death, his presence commanded respect from both mortal and spirit. "Odysseus, son of Laertes," the prophet spoke after drinking deeply from the sacrificial blood, his voice echoing strangely in that twilight realm. "Why have you left the sunlight to visit this cheerless place? Step back from the pit and lower your sword, that I may drink again and speak the prophecies you seek." His words carried the weight of absolute truth, for death had stripped away all possibility of deception. "Great Tiresias," Odysseus replied with deep reverence, "I come seeking the path home to Ithaca, for the gods have led me far from familiar waters. The enchantress Circe told me that only you could reveal the way through the perils that await me. Speak, and I will heed your words as if they came from Zeus himself." The blind prophet nodded slowly, his ghostly features grave with the knowledge of what was to come. "Difficult is your road home, noble Odysseus, for you have angered Poseidon by blinding his son. Yet you may still reach Ithaca if you can control your men's desires when next you make landfall. You will come to an island where the cattle of the sun god Helios graze in eternal peace. Touch not these sacred beasts, no matter how great your hunger, for they belong to one who sees all things beneath heaven." The spirit's warning sent a chill through Odysseus's heart, for he knew how difficult it would be to restrain hungry men faced with such temptation. "And if this warning goes unheeded?" he asked, though he feared the answer. "Then you will lose both ship and crew," Tiresias replied sadly, "and reach home alone after many more years of wandering. Even then, your trials will not be ended, for trouble awaits you in your own palace. Suitors will fill your halls, consuming your wealth and pressing their suit upon your faithful wife. You must be strong and clever to reclaim what is yours by right." As the prophet spoke, other spirits pressed forward, eager for their turn to taste the blood and speak with the living hero. Among them came his mother Anticlea, whose gentle face filled Odysseus with both joy and sorrow. "My son," she whispered after drinking from the offering, "how comes it that you visit this place while still alive? I died of grief waiting for your return from Troy, and your father Laertes mourns in the hills, while your wife Penelope weaves by day and unweaves by night, holding off the suitors with her cunning." The pain of learning of his mother's death nearly broke Odysseus's resolve, but he forced himself to remain strong. He spoke with many other spirits that night, his fallen comrades from Troy, great kings and heroes of ages past, and women whose stories had become legend. Each conversation taught him something valuable about courage, wisdom, or the price of glory. As dawn approached in the world above, the spirits began to fade like morning mist before the sun. Tiresias spoke one final time, his voice growing faint as the connection between worlds weakened. "Remember my words well, Odysseus. Your homecoming depends upon wisdom more than strength, patience more than haste. The path ahead is long and perilous, but your clever mind and loyal heart will see you through if you do not let pride overcome prudence." With those words, the realm of the dead faded from sight, leaving Odysseus and his men alone on that strange shore as the first rays of actual sunlight pierced the supernatural mist. They hurried back to their ship with hearts heavy from what they had learned, knowing that greater trials lay ahead, but strengthened by the wisdom they had gained from those who had gone before. The ship sailed away from the realm of the dead as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, its warm rays a welcome relief after the cold shadows of Hades. But Odysseus found little comfort in the light, for the prophecies of Tiresias weighed heavily upon his mind like stones in his heart. He stood at the stern, watching the mysterious shoreline fade into mist, knowing that each league forward brought them closer to perils that would test not just their courage, but their very souls. For several days they sailed through waters that gradually returned to familiar blue, though strange currents tugged at their hull and the wind carried scents of flowers that bloomed on no earthly shore. The crew worked with quiet efficiency, sensing their captain's troubled mood and the weight of unspoken knowledge he carried. They had learned to trust his leadership through countless dangers, but something in his manner now spoke of trials more terrible than any they had yet faced. On the fourth morning, they spotted an island rising from the waves ahead, its shores gleaming white in the early sunlight. This was no ordinary landfall, though it appeared peaceful enough from a distance. The beaches were strewn with what looked like driftwood and scattered shells, while the interior showed green hills crowned with ancient groves. But Odysseus recognized this place from Circe's warnings, and his blood ran cold with the memory of her words. "My friends," he called, gathering his crew around him on the deck, his voice carrying the authority of command mixed with deep concern. "We approach the island of the Sirens, creatures whose voices can drive men mad with longing. Their songs promise knowledge of all things past and future, but those who listen sail their ships onto the jagged rocks and perish in the attempt to reach these deadly singers. We must take precautions if we are to pass safely." From his sea chest he produced a ball of the softest beeswax, warming it in his hands until it became pliable. "Stop your ears with this," he instructed, breaking off pieces for each man. "And no matter what you hear, do not remove it until we are well past the danger. As for myself, I would hear their song without succumbing to its spell, so you must bind me to the mast and ignore my pleas to be released." The men looked doubtful at this strange request, for who would willingly expose himself to such peril? But Eurylochus stepped forward with lengths of rope, understanding that his captain's curious nature was matched only by his cleverness. "If you command it, Lord," he said simply, "then we will obey, though it pain us to see you in distress." With careful knots, they secured Odysseus to the mast, the bonds tight enough to hold him fast but not so cruel as to cause harm. As they drew nearer to the Sirens' Isle, the false driftwood on the beaches revealed its true nature, the bleached bones of countless sailors who had answered the fatal call. Ships' ribs jutted from the sand like the skeletons of great fish, while skulls gazed with empty sockets toward the sea that had brought their owners to destruction. The sight sent shudders through the crew, but they pressed forward, trusting in their captain's wisdom. Then the singing began, voices of such ethereal beauty that they seemed to come from the very music of the spheres. The sirens appeared on the shore, their forms seeming to shift between woman and bird, their faces beautiful beyond mortal description. Their song rose and fell like gentle waves, each note perfectly pitched to touch the deepest longings of the human heart. "Come, famous Odysseus," they sang, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made the air itself shimmer, pride of the Greeks and glory of the age. "Stop your ship and listen to our song, for no man has ever sailed past our island without hearing the honey-sweet music that flows from our lips. We know all things that happened at Troy, all the sorrows that gods and mortals have endured, and all that shall come to pass upon the fertile earth." The temptation was almost overwhelming, for the song promised not just beauty but knowledge beyond mortal ken. Odysseus strained against his bonds, his mouth opening to cry out orders that would doom them all. The rope cut into his flesh as he struggled, desperate to reach those divine singers who offered to share the secrets of existence itself. His men, their ears safely sealed with wax, rode steadily onward, seeing his distress but following his earlier commands with perfect loyalty. For what seemed like hours but was perhaps only minutes, the ship sailed through waters that rang with supernatural music. The Sirens' song grew more urgent as they realized their prey was escaping, their voices rising in a crescendo of longing and promise that would have broken weaker wills. But the wax held firm in the sailors' ears, and the ropes held Odysseus fast, though his struggles left him bruised and bleeding. Only when the island had faded behind them did the crew dare remove their protective wax and release their captain from his bonds. Odysseus slumped against the mast, exhausted by his ordeal but triumphant in his victory over temptation. "Well done, my friends," he gasped, his voice hoarse from shouting commands they could not hear. "You have proven yourselves truer than the finest gold, and we have gained knowledge without paying the ultimate price." But their trials were far from over, for ahead lay a strait between two towering cliffs that marked one of the most dangerous passages in all the wine-dark sea. On one side lurked Scylla, a monster with 6 heads that snatched sailors from passing ships, while on the other side waited Charybdis, a whirlpool that could swallow entire vessels in its hungry maw. Odysseus had been warned of this choice between certain loss and total destruction, and he had made his terrible decision. "Listen well," he told his crew as they approached the narrow strait, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "We must steer close to Scylla's cliff, for though she will take some of us, Charybdis would claim us all. Row swift and straight, and do not look back no matter what you hear. Some prices must be paid to purchase the lives of the many." The passage was as terrible as the prophecies had foretold. As they hugged the cliff where Scylla dwelt, 6 serpentine necks shot down from the heights above, each bearing a head filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. In an instant, 6 of his best men were plucked from the deck, their screams echoing off the stone walls as they vanished into the monster's multiple maws. The remaining crew rowed with desperate strength, their faces wet with tears for their lost companions. But they emerged from the strait alive, though diminished by their loss. Behind them, Charybdis sucked down great volumes of seawater with a roar like thunder, confirming the wisdom of Odysseus's terrible choice. The survivors clung to their oars and to each other, grateful to be alive but mourning those who had paid the price for their passage. For days they sailed in subdued silence, the memory of their lost friends casting a shadow over their journey. The sea around them grew calmer, its waters taking on a golden hue that spoke of divine influence. Strange fish swam alongside their vessel, their scales glittering like precious metals, while birds of impossible beauty flew overhead in perfect formations. Then, on the horizon, appeared an island more beautiful than any they had yet encountered. Its shores were silver sand dotted with pearls, while inland rose hills covered with grass so green it seemed to glow with inner light. Rivers of crystal clear water flowed down from mountain peaks that touched the clouds, and the very air shimmered with an otherworldly radiance. This was Thrinacia, the island of the sun god Helios, where his sacred cattle grazed in eternal peace. "Captain," said Eurylochus, his voice filled with longing as he gazed upon that paradisiacal shore, "surely we can rest here for a few days. Our supplies run low, and the men are weary from rowing and sorrow. See how peaceful and welcoming this place appears. What harm could come from a brief respite in such a haven?" But Odysseus remembered Tiresias's warning with perfect clarity, and his heart filled with dread at the sight of that too perfect island. "No," he said firmly, though he could see the exhaustion in his men's faces and knew their need for rest was real. "This is the island of the sun god's cattle, and we are forbidden to land here. Death awaits any who harm those sacred beasts, and I will not see more of my friends perish for want of caution." But fate, it seemed, had other plans, for even as he spoke, the wind died away to nothing, leaving their ship becalmed in the golden waters surrounding the forbidden island. The sails hung limp as wet cloth, and no amount of rowing could make headway against the strange currents that seemed to draw them inexorably toward the dangerous shore. For 3 days they struggled against the mystical forces that held them, growing weaker and more desperate with each passing hour. "Lord Odysseus," Eurylochus finally said, his voice carrying the weight of the crew's desperation, "we cannot continue without rest and fresh supplies. If we attempt to remain at sea, we will surely perish from thirst and exhaustion. Let us land just long enough to gather strength, and we swear by all the gods that we will not touch the sacred cattle." Against his better judgment, Odysseus finally agreed, but only after extracting the most solemn oaths from every man aboard. "Swear to me by the river Styx," he commanded, invoking the most binding oath known to gods and mortals alike, "that you will eat only the provisions we carry and touch nothing that belongs to Helios. Our lives depend upon keeping this promise." They beached their ship on that silver shore and made camp beneath trees that bore fruit like golden apples. The island's beauty was even more overwhelming up close, with flowers that sang in harmony with the breeze and streams that tasted sweeter than the finest wine. But most wondrous of all were the cattle that grazed on the eternal grass, beasts of perfect form whose hides gleamed like polished bronze and whose eyes held the wisdom of ages. For a month they remained on that enchanted isle, living off their dwindling supplies, while the mysterious calm continued to hold their ship motionless. Each day the cattle grazed peacefully nearby, their very presence a constant temptation to men whose food grew scarcer with each passing sunrise. Odysseus spent his time in prayer and contemplation, seeking some sign from the gods that would release them from their predicament. But the gods, it seemed, were testing them with a trial more subtle than monsters or storms. As their provisions dwindled to nothing, the men began to eye the sacred cattle with increasing desperation. Hunger gnawed at their bellies like a living thing, while the beautiful beasts grazed just beyond their reach, their flesh promising relief from the torment of starvation. "How long must we suffer?" whispered one sailor to another as they huddled around their meager fire, their stomachs cramping with emptiness. "The gods have abandoned us here to die slowly, while salvation grazes within arrow shot. Surely Helios would understand if we took just one beast to preserve our lives." Odysseus heard such mutterings and redoubled his efforts to find another solution, ranging far across the island in search of food that would not bring divine wrath upon them. But the island, for all its beauty, offered nothing edible save the forbidden cattle and the fruits that grew too high to reach. It was as if the gods had designed this place specifically to test mortal resolve against the ultimate temptation. The crisis came when Odysseus, exhausted by sleepless nights of worry, finally succumbed to slumber while praying in a sacred grove. Eurylochus, driven beyond endurance by the sight of his starving comrades, gathered the men around him with desperation burning in his eyes. "My friends," he said, his voice shaking with hunger and determination, "all deaths are hateful to mortals, but starvation is the most wretched way to die. Let us take the finest of these cattle and sacrifice properly to the gods, promising Helios a temple when we reach home. Better to risk divine anger than face certain death from hunger." The famished men needed little persuasion, their oaths forgotten in the face of imminent starvation. They selected the finest bull from the sacred herd, a magnificent creature whose hide gleamed like burnished gold in the afternoon sun. With trembling hands they performed the ritual slaughter, offering prayers to Helios even as they committed the very sacrilege they had sworn to avoid. The moment the sacred blood touched the earth, the island itself seemed to cry out in anguish. The very stones groaned, the trees whispered accusations, and the remaining cattle lowed with voices like funeral dirges. Far above, the sun god himself felt the death of his beloved beast and burned with anger brighter than his chariot's flames. Odysseus awoke to the smell of roasting meat and knew immediately what had transpired. His heart filled with despair as he saw his men gathered around their fire, their faces showing both satisfaction at their meal and terror at what they had done. "Fools!" he cried, his voice cracking with anguish. "What have you done? You have doomed us all with your faithlessness." But it was too late for regrets or recriminations. Even as the men tried to justify their actions, signs of divine wrath began to manifest around them. The meat on their spits began to low like living cattle, while the hides crawled across the ground as if still animated by life. Blood flowed from the carved flesh like crimson tears, and the very air grew thick with the promise of retribution. For 6 days more they remained trapped on the island, feasting on the forbidden meat while supernatural portents multiplied around them. Then, as suddenly as it had died, the wind returned with the force of a hurricane, driving their ship toward the open sea whether they willed it or not. They had barely time to raise anchor before they were swept away from that cursed shore, carrying with them the seeds of their own destruction. The ship fled from Thrinacia like a thing possessed, driven by winds that howled with the voice of divine anger. Behind them, the island of the sun god burned with light, so brilliant it hurt to look upon, while ahead stretched waters dark as storm clouds and twice as threatening. Odysseus stood at the helm, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering oar, knowing that the wrath of Helios would not be long in coming. The men worked frantically to secure the rigging as the ship pitched and rolled through increasingly violent seas. Their faces showed the haunted look of those who know they have transgressed beyond forgiveness, yet they clung to the hope that somehow their beloved captain would find a way to save them as he had so many times before. But Odysseus himself felt the weight of fate pressing down upon them like a mountain, and his clever mind found no stratagem that could turn aside the god's justice. For 3 days they rode the storm-tossed waves, bailing water and fighting to keep their vessel afloat against winds that seemed determined to drive them to the bottom of the sea. The sky above was a roiling mass of black clouds shot through with lightning that revealed glimpses of divine figures moving among the tempest. Helios himself could be seen at times, his chariot racing across the storm front while his horses breathed fire that turned rain to steam. On the 4th day, as they struggled against waves tall as mountains, Zeus himself entered the fray. The king of the gods appeared in the storm clouds above them, his mighty hand grasping a thunderbolt that blazed with the light of 100 suns. His voice boomed across the heavens like the crash of worlds colliding, each word a judgment that sealed the fate of the sacrilegious crew. Mortals who dare defile the sacred herds of my son Helios, Zeus thundered, his words shaking the very foundations of sea and sky. Accept now the punishment your crimes have earned. No longer shall you sail the wine-dark waters or see the shores of home. Let this be a lesson to all who would break their oaths and offend the gods. The thunderbolt fell like a spear of pure destruction, striking the ship's mast and splitting it from top to bottom. The vessel, which had carried them safely through so many perils, began to break apart as if it were made of straw rather than seasoned wood. The crew cried out in terror as deck planks splintered beneath their feet and the hull cracked open like an egg struck by a hammer. One by one, the faithful companions who had followed Odysseus through 10 years of war and wandering were swept away by the merciless waves. Some tried to swim in the churning waters, their armor dragging them down to join the countless sailors who had perished in those depths. Others clung to floating debris for a few precious moments before the hungry sea claimed them as well. Their captain watched in anguish as each familiar face disappeared beneath the foam, taking with them years of shared trials and brotherhood. Odysseus himself survived only by lashing together the mast and keel of his destroyed ship, creating a makeshift raft that barely kept him above the murderous waves. For 9 days he drifted on that crude vessel, battered by storms and scorched by the pitiless sun, while the bodies of his men sank into the depths around him. He had no food save what rain he could catch in his cupped hands, no shelter from the elements save his own endurance. On the 10th day, more dead than alive, he washed ashore on an island that seemed touched by gentler gods. This was Ogygia, realm of the nymph Calypso, whose beauty was legendary even among the immortals. She found him collapsed on her beach like a piece of storm rack, his skin burned by salt and sun, his strength nearly spent. With hands soft as silk and cool as morning dew, she tended his wounds and nursed him back to health. Calypso's island was a paradise that made even the realm of the Lotus-Eaters seem plain by comparison. Here grew every fruit known to gods or mortals, while springs of sweet water bubbled up from hidden sources and flowers bloomed in eternal spring. The nymph herself was more beautiful than mortal words could describe, her voice like music and her laughter like silver bells chiming in a gentle breeze. "Stay with me, noble Odysseus," she pleaded as his strength returned, her divine eyes shining with love that had grown from admiration to obsession. "Forget your mortal wife and island kingdom, for what are they compared to immortality at my side? I can grant you eternal youth and freedom from all the sorrows that plague mankind. Here you will know only pleasure and peace, with no need to face the trials that await in the world beyond my shores." For 7 long years Odysseus remained on that enchanted isle, trapped by the nymph's love as surely as if he had been bound with chains of adamant. Though his body was comfortable and his physical needs met beyond measure, his heart yearned constantly for his homeland and the wife who waited there. Each day he would climb to the highest cliff on Calypso's island and gaze across the endless sea toward the horizon where Ithaca lay, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The gods above took notice of his plight, for even divine justice had limits, and Odysseus had already paid a heavy price for his crew's transgression. Athena, goddess of wisdom and his patron since the war at Troy, approached her father Zeus with a plea for the hero's release. "Great father," she said, her gray eyes flashing with compassion and determination, "how long must noble Odysseus suffer for the sins of others? His wife Penelope remains faithful despite the pressure of countless suitors, while his son Telemachus has grown to manhood without knowing his father's face. Surely the time has come for mercy to temper justice. Zeus, whose anger had cooled with the passing years, nodded slowly at his daughter's words. "You speak wisely, child," he rumbled, his voice now holding the warmth of summer thunder rather than winter's wrath. "Let Hermes go to Calypso with our command that she release the hero. His wanderings have lasted long enough, and home calls to him with a voice stronger than any immortal love." Swift Hermes, messenger of the gods, descended to Ogygia like a falling star, his winged sandals carrying him across vast distances in the blink of an eye. He found Calypso in her sacred grove, weaving at a golden loom while she sang songs of such beauty that even the trees swayed to her music. Though she argued and pleaded when she heard Zeus's command, the nymph knew better than to oppose the will of the king of the gods. "Odysseus," she called to him, where he sat on his cliff of sorrow, her voice heavy with the pain of impending loss. "The gods have decreed that you must leave my island. I will help you build a raft worthy of the journey home, though it breaks my immortal heart to let you go. Take my gifts of food and fresh water, fair winds and divine protection, but know that you go toward trials that may yet destroy you." With his own hands, guided by Calypso's immortal skill, Odysseus built a raft from the finest trees on her island. The vessel was small but seaworthy, its joints fitted with precision, and its sail woven from threads that gleamed like captured starlight. When it was finished, he provisioned it with food that would never spoil and water that would never run dry, gifts from a goddess whose love he could not return. On the morning of his departure, Calypso stood on the shore with tears like liquid diamonds streaming down her perfect cheeks. "Go then to your mortal wife and your aging father," she said, her voice breaking despite her divine nature. "But remember sometimes the goddess who loved you enough to let you leave when she could have kept you forever." With those words, she summoned a fair wind that filled his sail and carried him away from paradise toward the uncertain destiny that awaited him. For 17 days Odysseus sailed across waters that grew gradually more familiar, his heart lifting with each league that brought him closer to home. The stars above seemed friendlier now, arranged in patterns he remembered from his youth, while the very color of the sea began to match his memories of Ithaca's shores. But Poseidon, returning from distant lands, spotted the lone raft on his domain and remembered his old grudge against the hero who had blinded his son. "So," the sea god rumbled, his voice causing whirlpools to form in the calm waters, "Zeus thinks to send this mortal home while I am away? We shall see if he reaches Ithaca as easily as he hopes." With a gesture of his mighty trident, Poseidon summoned a storm that made all previous tempests seem like gentle breezes. The waves rose like moving mountains around the tiny raft, each one threatening to dash it to pieces against the next. Odysseus fought the steering oar with desperate strength, but even his skill could not prevail against the unleashed fury of the sea itself. His craft was torn apart piece by piece, leaving him clinging to a single beam while mountainous waves crashed over his head. But salvation came from an unexpected source. Ino, a sea goddess who had once been mortal herself, took pity on the struggling hero and rose from the depths to offer aid. "Take my veil," she commanded, pressing a divine garment into his hands, "and abandon your raft. Swim for the nearest shore, and my protection will keep you from drowning in Poseidon's wrath." For 2 days and nights Odysseus swam through storm-tossed seas, kept afloat by the goddess's gift, and sustained by his iron will to see home again. When he finally glimpsed land ahead, it was not Ithaca, but the island of the Phaeacians, a people blessed by the gods with magical ships and generous hearts. He crawled ashore more dead than alive, his body battered by waves and exhausted by his ordeal. It was there that Princess Nausicaa found him, having come to the shore with her maidens to wash clothes by the river. Though frightened at first by his wild appearance, she soon recognized the nobility beneath his bedraggled exterior and offered him the hospitality that was sacred to her people. Covered by a cloak she provided, Odysseus made his way to the palace of King Alcinous, where he would find the means for his final journey home. The Phaeacians listened with wonder to his tale, their hearts moved by the trials he had endured and the faithful love that had sustained him through 20 years of separation. Their ships were the swiftest in all the world, able to cross vast distances while their passengers slept in comfort. "We will take you home," King Alcinous declared, his voice warm with sympathy and respect, "for no man should be kept from his homeland when the gods have decreed his wanderings at an end." That very night, while Odysseus slept the deep sleep of utter exhaustion, the magical Phaeacian ship carried him across the wine-dark sea toward Ithaca. The vessel moved without oars or sails, guided by divine power and the skill of sailors who could navigate by instinct alone. By dawn they had reached the shores of his island kingdom, where they gently placed him on the beach, along with the treasure they had given him as parting gifts. Odysseus awoke to the sound of familiar birds singing in trees he had climbed as a boy. The very scent of the air told him he was home at last, though 20 years of wandering had changed him so much that he barely recognized the landscape of his youth. Athena appeared to him in the guise of a young shepherd, confirming that this was indeed Ithaca, but warning him of the dangers that awaited. "Your palace is filled with suitors," the goddess told him, her grey eyes serious with concern. "Men who consume your wealth while pressing their suit upon faithful Penelope. They plot to kill Telemachus when he returns from seeking news of you, and they would certainly murder you as well if they knew of your arrival. You must approach with caution and cunning, for force alone will not suffice against such numbers." With Athena's help, Odysseus disguised himself as an aged beggar, his appearance so changed that his own family would not recognize him. His skin was weathered and wrinkled, his hair white as sea foam, his back bent with apparent age. Only his eyes remained the same, holding the keen intelligence that had made him famous throughout the world. In this humble guise, he made his way toward the palace he had not seen for 20 years, his heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. Would Penelope still be waiting? Would Telemachus accept a father he had never known? These questions tormented him as he walked the familiar paths of his homeland, noting how some things had changed while others remained exactly as he remembered. Near the palace, he encountered Eumaeus, the faithful swineherd who had served his family since childhood. Though the loyal servant did not recognize his master beneath the disguise, he offered hospitality with the generous heart that had always marked him. "Come, old man," Eumaeus said kindly. "Share my humble meal and shelter for the night. These are troubled times, but no traveler should go hungry while I have bread to share." That evening, as they sat by the fire in the swineherd's cottage, Odysseus listened to tales of how the suitors had overrun his palace like a plague of locusts. They numbered more than 100, the finest young men from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, all seeking to marry Penelope and claim the throne. "They feast in the great hall every day," Eumaeus said with disgust, "consuming the flocks and herds, drinking the wine cellars dry, and showing no respect for the gods or the laws of hospitality." "And what of the queen?" Odysseus asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Does she show favor to any of these suitors?" Eumaeus shook his head with admiration that bordered on reverence. "Lady Penelope remains as faithful as the day her husband sailed for Troy. She has delayed choosing among the suitors with every clever stratagem she can devise, always hoping that noble Odysseus will return. But the pressure grows daily, and I fear she cannot hold them off much longer without bringing violence upon herself and young Prince Telemachus." The next morning brought Telemachus himself to the swineherd's cottage, having returned from his journey to seek news of his father. Odysseus studied the young man with wonder and pride, seeing in him a blend of his own features and Penelope's grace. Though Telemachus had grown to manhood in his absence, there was something in his bearing that spoke of royal blood and noble character. When Eumaeus left to carry news of the prince's return to Penelope, Athena appeared once more to Odysseus. With a touch of her hand, she restored his true appearance, revealing him in all his weathered glory to the son who had never known him. "Father," Telemachus whispered, his eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. "Can it truly be you after all these years?" The reunion was everything Odysseus had dreamed of during his long exile, father and son embracing with tears of joy streaming down their faces. They talked long into the night, sharing 20 years of separation in a few precious hours. Together they planned how to deal with the suitors, for Telemachus had grown wise beyond his years and proved a worthy partner in his father's schemes. "Tomorrow," Odysseus said as dawn approached, "I will return to my beggar's disguise and enter the palace. Let no one know my true identity until the time is right. When I give the signal, we will strike together, father and son united as we should have been all these years." Telemachus nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. The great hall of the palace was exactly as Odysseus remembered it, though now it reeked of wine and excess rather than the ordered dignity of his reign. The suitors lounged on couches that had once hosted kings and heroes, their loud voices and crude laughter echoing off walls that had heard the songs of ancient bards. At the high table sat Penelope, still beautiful despite the years of sorrow, her eyes distant as she endured another day of unwanted courtship. In his beggar's rags, Odysseus moved among the suitors like a ghost from the past, observing their arrogance and cataloguing their crimes against his household. Some threw scraps at him like a dog, while others ignored him entirely, but a few showed the courtesy that marked them as men of honor even in their misguided pursuit of his wife. All the while, his eyes never left Penelope, drinking in the sight of her beloved face after 20 years of longing. The test came when Penelope, driven by desperation and divine inspiration, announced a contest among the suitors. She brought forth Odysseus's great bow, a weapon so mighty that no man save its owner had ever been able to string it. "Whoever can string this bow," she declared, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands, "and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads in a row, shall win my hand in marriage." One by one the suitors tried and failed, their strength insufficient to even bend the massive bow. They heated it by the fire and rubbed it with fat, but still the weapon remained as inflexible as iron in their hands. Finally, the disguised Odysseus asked to try, despite the mockery and protests of the arrogant young men who saw only a decrepit beggar. With hands that remembered every curve and balance of the beloved weapon, Odysseus strung the bow as easily as a bard strings his lyre. The familiar weight felt like greeting an old friend, and when he drew the string, it sang with a note pure as a nightingale's call. Without apparent effort, he sent an arrow through all 12 axe heads in perfect alignment, the bronze point striking the far wall with a sound like thunder. In the stunned silence that followed, Odysseus cast off his beggar's disguise and stood revealed in his true form, the bow still singing in his hands. "I am Odysseus," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of kings and the wrath of the gods themselves, "son of Laertes, sacker of cities, and rightful king of Ithaca. I have returned to reclaim what is mine and punish those who have abused my hospitality." What followed was swift and terrible, justice long delayed but finally delivered. With Telemachus at his side and the loyal servants rallying to their cause, Odysseus brought down the divine wrath upon the suitors who had defiled his home. His arrows flew like lightning, each one finding its mark with the precision of divine justice, while his sword sang its own deadly song. When the battle was over and the last of the guilty had fallen, Odysseus stood alone with Penelope in the great hall that had seen both their wedding feast and this final reckoning. She studied him with eyes that had grown wise through years of patient waiting, seeing past the scars and silver hair to the man she had loved since their youth. "My husband," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion too deep for mere words, "you have come home to me at last." In that moment, 20 years of separation vanished like morning mist, and they were once again the young lovers who had pledged their hearts beneath the olive tree that still grew in their wedding chamber. The olive tree, their secret, their sign, the living symbol of their love that had grown strong and enduring through all the years of trial. When Odysseus spoke of how he had carved their marriage bed from its living trunk, Penelope knew beyond all doubt that this was truly her beloved husband, returned from his long Odyssey to the home that had always waited for him. That night they lay together in their marriage bed, its posts still growing from the roots of the ancient olive tree, and spoke of all the years that had passed like a dream of sorrow and separation. Outside their window, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, the same constellations that had guided Odysseus across the wine-dark sea to this moment of perfect peace. "Sleep now, my beloved," Penelope whispered as dawn approached, her fingers gentle on his weathered brow, "for you are home at last, and all your wanderings are ended." And there, in the bed he had carved with his own hands beneath the tree that symbolized their enduring love, Odysseus closed his eyes and slept the deep, peaceful sleep of a hero whose journey was finally complete. The wine-dark sea still sang its eternal song beyond the shores of Ithaca, calling to other heroes and promising new adventures to those brave enough to answer. But for Odysseus, the call of home had proven stronger than any siren's song, and in the arms of his faithful wife, he found the greatest treasure of all, the love that had waited 20 years for his return and would endure for all the years to come. Thus ends the tale of Odysseus's great journey home, a story of courage and cunning, of love and loyalty, of the trials that test the human spirit and the rewards that await those who never surrender hope. Let it carry you now to your own peaceful shores, where dreams of adventure mingle with the sweet comfort of home, and where the greatest journeys of all begin in the quiet chambers of sleep.